All right. I'm just curious, just by way of survey. I know it was a new thing, so I'm not expecting a whole lot of hands raised, but I am curious how many were able to listen to the midweek lessons. Midweek lessons, anyone? Okay. All right. So those of you who didn't will um, you'll get a brief review, but I would recommend that you watch the midweek lessons. They aren't absolutely necessary, but they will lead into the topic we're going to cover today. So we're in the last section of our sections on how we received our Bibles. And so the last section is modern era translations. We're going to be covering why do they exist and what do we do with them. Translation philosophy, translation trustworthiness, and translation tribalism. And our theme verse for this section is in the same way, unless you use your tongue for intelligible speech, how will what be spoken be known? For you will be speaking into the air. Okay, so we need to use intelligible speech, which is why we have modern era translations. And when we last left off, before we got into the section on textual criticism, how we received the words of God, we were on ancient to Reformation era translations. And one of the last slides I left you with was what was happening from the 1700s to the late 1800s. That's where we were going. And so I spent some time this week kind of bridging that gap on a more specific level. And so what we covered this week, or what I covered when we talked about this, is how the source text and apparatus would turn into a translation and its footnotes. And then the source text and the apparatus kept progressing forward, getting updates and such happening to it. But it was no longer impacting our translation and footnotes until 1881. And then we had those two come together again. So what I did last week is I tried to bridge that gap a little bit. We had already talked about John Mill and the Textus Receptus of 1707. But this week, what I spent time talking about was Karl Lockman, and how he did the same thing as John Mill and those before him. He had some manuscripts, but instead of just updating the Textus Receptus, he started fresh. He looked at all the manuscripts again with fresh eyes and developed a critical edition. Then we talked about Tischendorf and his discovery of Sinaiticus and some of the myths around that. We also talked about Samuel Tregelles and his critical edition as well as the New Testament. And then, let's see, I need to jump to slide 10. Then we also talked about the English side, what happened on the English side. So on the English side, we talked about the revision in 1769 by Benjamin Blaney. That was a massive undertaking. That was a huge revision of the KJV. Thousands of changes made in punctuation, errors corrected, spelling standardized. We had a whole lot of things happening in 1769. And then we spent a good amount of time going through the Webster Bible, and actually, I'm going to do this. Here we go. And his American Dictionary of the English Language. So the first American dictionary, Webster started with that in 1828. And he used the KJV for a lot of his example sentences. So when he would give a word, he would give example sentences. Oftentimes they were verses from the Bible. And that work caused him to realize that the KJV has a lot of archaisms in it, a lot of what we call false friends. In fact, that's actually what we'll go to. And that prompted him to do a revision of the KJV himself. And this would be the Webster Bible. And so we went through the preface of the Webster Bible where he describes the situation of American English, and in that, why he felt the need to do this update to the KJV. So this is what he says here. We'll read this, and this will help lead us into today's lesson. But in the lapse of 2 or 3 centuries, changes have taken place which, in particular passages, impair the beauty, in others obscure the sense of the original languages. Some words have fallen into disuse, the signification of others in the current popular use is not the same as it was when they were introduced into the version. The effect of these changes is that when some words are not understood by common readers who have no access to commentaries and who will always compose a great proportion of readers, while other words being not used in the sense, or being, I can't see my whole screen up here, being now used in a sense different from that which they had when the translation was made, present a wrong signification or false ideas. Whenever words are understood in a sense different from that which they had when introduced, and different from that of the original languages, they do not present to the reader the Word of God. This circumstance is very important, even in things not the most essential, and in essential points, mistakes may be very injurious. So what he's saying here is language has changed. In the last couple of centuries, language has changed, and what this has done is it has made some of the style obscure. It's no longer as beautiful as it once was. He says that the style is different. He'll say some words, we don't even use them anymore. These are words that are archaic. And then he says in some words, they've changed their meaning. So we still use the word, but we don't use them the same way. And this is language change. I've harped on this all throughout class. Now, keep in mind, this is early 1800s, he's saying this, and we still use the KJV today, and it's only gotten worse. In fact, he says it's going to get worse. He says his translation won't survive 200 years. So, and it doesn't. It didn't survive even, it never became super popular in his day, unfortunately. I cover that in class, but it's because of that American Bible Society push to get all of a Bible into every home. He just could not compete. He didn't have the money or the resources to compete with that. And so his Bible never took off, unfortunately, but I think it's a good bridge between the 1611 and maybe like a NKJV today. All right, so that's what he says. He says language change is a problem. And then he says he's got another issue that he wants to raise. And this is the end of his preface. This is the last section of his preface where he talks about why he wants to do this update. And this section, the last section, is called Euphemisms. And so he's going to have some complaints about the KJV, and I think most of you will be familiar with these complaints, even though he doesn't say them outright. I'll try to give some examples. He says, in no respect does the present version of the scripture require amendments more than in the many words and phrases which cannot now be uttered in promiscuous company, without violence to decency. In early stages of society, when men are savage or half civilized, and terms are not offensive, but in the present state of refinement, the utterance of many words and passages of our version is not to be endured. And it is well known that some parents do not permit their children to read the scriptures without prescribing to them the chapters. And so what he's saying there is they just don't let the kids read the scriptures freely. They say you can read from here, but not from here. Don't read these passages. So to retain such offensive language in the popular version is, in my view, injudicious, if not unjustifiable. For it gives occasion to unbelievers and to persons of levity to cast contempt upon the sacred oracles, call in question their inspiration, and this weapon is used with no inconsiderable effect. Further, many words and phrases are so offensive, especially to females, as to create a reluctance in young persons to attend Bible classes in schools in which they are required to read passages which cannot be repeated without a blush, and containing words which on other occasions could not utter without rebuke. The effect is to divert the mind from the matter of the language of the scriptures, and thus to, in a degree, frustrate the purpose of giving instruction. Purity of mind is a Christian virtue that ought to be carefully cherished, and purity of language is one of the guards which protect this virtue. I have attempted to remove in a good degree this objection to this aversion. It was my wish to make, thank you. I'm going to adjust my screen here in a second. To make some further alterations in this particular, but the difficulties occurred, which I could not well, remove. Okay. So let me see here. There we go. I can see my screen better now. All right. It was just cutting off the edges right there. All right. So what's he saying here? He's saying some words have changed so much that now when we use them, they're offensive, they're vulgar, they're profane, and we we can't have children even read some of these passages without causing them to blush or make snarky remarks. And I grew up with this. And the example I gave in my midweek class, it's not one of the ones that actually Webster has to change because it's still common in his day, but is in the KJV is the word ass for donkey, right? You don't have to sit in any KJV only church for a Sunday school lesson for very long. You get to the topic of Balaam's donkey, which is in almost every Sunday school class. And if you read the passage verbatim, you'll get snarky kids every time. And so this is one of the areas I remember one of the deacons in our church saying, if at the very least we should change that to donkey, if we're going to talk about an update. I spent some considerable more time on this subject in the midweek class, so if you want to do that, I'm not going to do that again here, but if you want to go through that, listen to that midweek class, I go through more times. However, there are other words that he felt were offensive and needed to be updated in 1833, and so he updated those as well. Now, I said in my class, I have some objections to his view here. I actually agree with him that if a common word becomes a vulgar word, it should be changed. My contention with him is that these words shouldn't exist at all in the Bible. And I'm going to try to show some cases where I think there's going to be some offensive language in the Bible, and the translation, if it's going to be accurate, should try to retain that sense, that offensive-ness, okay? And so we're going to cover today. I had a couple of options of what to do today as far as how to move the class forward. I thought I could give you guys the history of what happens in 1881, or I could talk about this. What makes an accurate translation? What makes an accurate translation? And I thought to myself, this would probably be more interesting for you guys, but I also think it's going to be more practical. So I'm going to give the history of what happens in 1870 to 1881 in my midweek class this week, so you'll get the history. But today, we're going to talk about something that I think is on the minds of almost every single Christian at some point, is what makes an accurate translation. And so when it comes to translation, I think most people immediately think of that first corner there. Sense, right? So we have three things that make an accurate translation, what I call the three corners of an accurate translation: sense, register, and tone. And so I would say probably sense is probably the most objective of the three, objective measure of the three. And so most people spend most of their time on sense. In fact, we've probably spent most of our time in this class on the subject of sense. However, most people are only focusing on semantic overlap of the source language and the receptor language. They're not usually thinking about idiomatic meanings like we had with Exodus 3:4, where it describes God as having a long nose in Hebrew, but you won't find an English translation that says God has a long nose. They all say something to the effect of God is long-suffering, because God having a long nose means that it's long-suffering. Or slow to anger, or something of that nature. And so we've covered this a lot in previous classes, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on sense today, because I think most of us get that, and we've harped on that quite a bit. So, and I will say this, your translations, the major translations, the ones I've generally talked about in this class, they all provide accurate senses to the Bible. So you have accurate translations with regard to sense. All right, so then I want to go to this bottom. Actually, let me read sense up here. Let me bring this over here. Sense. Okay, the receptor language conveys the same semantic and idiomatic meaning as the source language. All right, so that's the sense. So you've got two people here, and they're both talking, and they're saying the same thing in two different languages. That's an accurate sense. Okay, now we're going to go down here to register. This is where we'll start spending some time. Register. The receptor language conveys the same level of formality and technicality as the source language. And so here, I've got two little icons here. I've got the pen and quill, on a scroll to convey this sort of seriousness, this high formality, right? When you write with a pen and quill, you're not going to have the same register or formality as you might with the text message box next to it, right? You see that bubble pop up? There's going to be two levels of formality. I see this all the time. When people handwrite me a letter, they generally will raise the formality a little bit, versus that person who sends me a text message will lower the formality. So an accurate translation will match that register, that formality. Okay, that's where we're going here. So in technical speak as well. So there are certain words in my job that are technical words. Let's see, if I thought I wrote down, I didn't. I think I scrapped it. So I'll use Christianity as an example. We have technical words in Christianity. Words like atonement and justification and things of that nature. These are technical words in Christianity. They have a specific meaning in Christianity that aren't typically used outside of Christianity, right? And those would be technical. And those technicalities tend to be drawn from Scripture. So Scripture is using them in a technical way, so we use them in a technical way, okay? And so to match the register is really important. If the Bible says something in very common speech, it should be translated in common speech. If you raise the register, it's not going to be accurate, okay? This isn't a level of accuracy. If you lower the register, it's not going to be accurate. And so when it comes to formality, generally speaking, our everyday language is informal. That's what makes it informal. It's because we use it every day. When we raise the register, then it's formal. That's not our everyday speech, okay? And so when we sit down, like I said, to write a letter, we might up the ante, speak a little bit more formally. I have sent out a number of applications to jobs with cover letters, very formal, okay? I was very formal when I wrote those, all right? And there's a guy on Instagram who I follow by the handle of Berber English, who does videos generally demonstrating how to move into a higher and higher register of speak. And so I'm going to play a video from him in which he's going to describe how to say, I don't know, and just say it higher and higher. Now, he does this for entertainment, but there's a lot of truth to this as well. So we'll go ahead and listen to him. Hopefully this will come up easy enough. Come on. There we go. All right.
I don't care. It's entirely up to you. I'm not particularly concerned, thank you. I should be perfectly comfortable with that. I'm wholly untroubled by the matter. If interest were currency, I should be destitute indeed. It matters not in the least, and I therefore needn't clutter my mind with such irrelevancies. It is altogether beneath the dignity of my concern, and I find myself possessing neither the patience nor the desire to dwell upon so paltry a matter.
So, as you can see, he said the exact same thing. I don't care. I think I said I don't know. I don't care. He said it the exact same way, and he just kept raising the register. He kept raising the formality of it to the degree that it wasn't at all common speech, right? It was very uppity, very formal, and comedic because it was so formal. Also because there's a lot of underhanded offenses in some of those. So I appreciate him. He does videos like this all the time. And so the point here is, even though that this is done as a comical entertainment, it's to demonstrate that you can say the same thing at different registers, okay? So in speaking about Bible translating, the majority of the Bible is written in common speak, okay? The Old Testament is common Hebrew. The Old Testament in Aramaic in most places is common Aramaic, and the New Testament is common Greek. So if the majority of our translation should be, if the majority of our Bible is in common speak, the majority of our translation should be in common speak, common everyday English. If they value retaining the register the same way that they value retaining the sense. So if you want to retain the sense, you also will want to retain the register. But there are times where the register is elevated in some places in the Bible, specifically in maybe like political conversations, political speech, ceremonial. And there's other kinds of technical jargon that happens, and so our English translations should also pick up on that technical language. And I will say, and then there are times where the speech gets even lower than common, where they start to get into vulgarities, okay? And when they get into these vulgarities, our English translations should match that lower speech. And in my experience, when I started to go through this years ago, what I found is no translation has a problem raising the register. They have a really hard time lowering the register. And so what I want to show you today is some of those examples in which register comes into play, and we should pay attention to how it sounds and whether or not our translations are accurately representing the register. So I'm going to give you some examples of this. This first one is actually a kind of a counterexample. I'll give you a counterexample. And the reason why is because this is probably the most common example that comes up is in Philippians 3:8, in which it is often said that this Greek word, skubala, is the equivalent to our vulgar S word, okay? The S word. I've heard this many times growing up, that Paul is saying something quite vulgar here in Greek. And so you'll see my English translation up here as my example is the CSB, and they don't use the S word, they use dung, okay? Now, what's very fascinating about this is as I was working on this over the last, 3 or 4 weeks, an article came up that actually refutes this. It's called Did Paul Use Profanity? And it's by a Facebook friend of mine who is a scholar, and his name is Gary Manning Jr. And what he does in this article is he attempts to demonstrate that that word skubala in Greek actually is not the equivalent to our S word in English. It is more equivalent to the word dung. And what he does is he just goes through as many examples as he can, actually every example. He found every example of its use in the 1st and 2nd century, and he put them all to data and the type of register in that document and so on and so forth. And he said this word is never used in an emphatic way that would be like our S word, right? Something of that nature. Again, I'm going to do my best to be sensitive with this topic because this is going to come up, and it's uncomfortable sometimes to talk about this. But he demonstrates that Paul is using a more formal word that is acceptable in medical speech, that it's acceptable in promiscuous, or I say promiscuous because of the Webster, but in mixed company, and different places this word is acceptable. Well, in the same way, the word dung is acceptable, right? And we have different registers that we could say with this word, right? Dung is a popular one. But if I was going to go to the doctor, they'd probably say stool. That would be your medical term, stool. But if I was talking to my child, maybe Declan, and we had to talk about this, I'm not going to talk about it with Declan, don't worry. But if you were to have this sort of conversation with him, you would use a very low, infantile word, right? You would probably say something like poop, all right? But you wouldn't see that in our translation because that's not the word Paul used. Paul didn't use that very low, childlike register, and he didn't use the profane, vulgar register, and he didn't use the medical register. He used a common register, okay? Something like dung, all right? And Gary does a good job in his article demonstrating that. I actually provided a significant amount of pushback to Gary to see if I could find any holes in his argument. and every hole I punched, he plugged. So he did a really good job just answering my objections and convinced me that Paul indeed use a common word, not a profane word. And so, but I can't tell you how many times I've heard pastors say that when coming to this verse, that Paul essentially swore when he said this. And I don't believe that to be the case. So let's look at some other registers that are a little easier to talk about, for me at least. All right, so here in 2 Kings 4:26, I'm not going to read all of these for the sake of time. Feel free to grab this video later and review them. But I want to provide some context. Elisha here has been being taken care of by this woman, and in return, the Lord blessed this woman with a son that she desperately wanted, right? But then one day, the son is out in the field, and he dies, and she's going to return to the prophet and ask him, why? Why did this happen? Why did you bless me with a son that you were ultimately going to take before his time? The pain is worse than the gain, okay? And so she's going to do that. Now, he's not there at the time when this occurs. She's coming by herself, and he sees her from afar. And he has a servant, and he says to his servant, I want you to move fast. I want you to get to her and get back to me before she gets here, because I want to know why she's coming. And so I have some things I want to ask. He wants to ask about her own well-being. He wants to ask about the well-being of her husband, and he wants to ask about the well-being of her son. And so he's going to send a messenger to ask those three questions. Now, in your mind, you want to ask someone how they're doing. How do you ask them? This is written in common Hebrew speak. This is common conversational speak in Hebrew. How would you send a message to someone and say, I want to know how you're doing? Would you say, is it well with thee? Is it well with thy husband? Is it well with the child? Is that how you would ask it? Common speech. Or would you say something like, maybe the NLT here, is everything all right with you, your husband, and your child? Right? Or would you say it more maybe like the NET, are you well? Are your husband and boy well? Or would you say it like the CSB? Are you all right? Is your husband all right? Is your son all right? My point here is not necessarily to answer it. Some of this register is going to be a little bit subjective, but some of it's going to be clearly objective. That's not common speech, right? Some of those you'll read up there and you'll be like, that's not at all how anybody would say it. Other ones you would say, I could see someone saying it like that, even if I maybe wouldn't say it like that. For me, I'll just tell you how I would say it. Are you okay? Is your husband okay? Is your son okay? That's how I'd ask it. None of those translations reflect how I would ask it. But I can see people saying it in a very common way, some of those ways up there, okay? So I'm not going to answer for you which one of these is the most common, but you should be able to hear the register, how she would say it, and then how she responds. So she gets asked the question, she's going to respond in common English. Would you answer if you were the one asked the question and you want to answer the way she answered? Would you say, it is well? Would you say, all is well? Would you say, it is going well? Would you say, everything's fine? Would you say, everything is all right? Would you say, it's all right? Or would you say, everything is fine again? So I just went through those up there. How would you respond? I'd probably respond, it's not up there. I'd probably say, I'm okay. Everything's okay. Okay is probably the vernacular I would use. That's not going to show up in most of our English translations. It's almost too low. All right? But I could see people saying things like fine and all right and using contractions. Would you use a contraction? Would you say it out very distinctly? All right? Contractions is very common speak. Saying it all the words outright is not common speech. Okay? It's a little more formal. But the Hebrew here is very conversational, very common. So how do these translations reflect register? All right, and this is a really good tool here for you when you're doing your Bible study and you're researching, and your translation reads a particular way, and you pick up another translation, and you're like, that reflects the register better. That helps me. Okay, so there's that one. Let's go to the next one. All right, this one, Genesis 25:30, this is going real low now in the register. You are probably very familiar with this passage, right? Esau is speaking in this passage. He comes back from hunting, and he hasn't eaten or drank anything in some time. He feels like, according to him, he's going to die. All right, he's that hungry. He's that thirsty. And if you could read the Hebrew or read any commentary that focuses on the grammar here, Esau's register in this verse is very low, extremely low. Some have called it caveman-ish. All right, he does not speak in common English or common Hebrew here. He's speaking in very broken Hebrew. It's not even comprehensible grammatically. All right, so I have what I would consider a very literal, very word for word translation of what it looks like in Hebrew at the top, which reads something like, let me gulp down some of that red, this red, there. Okay? If you notice in the KJV here, you see the word for pottage is in italics because he doesn't actually use the word pottage. That comes from inference because of we know that what Jacob was cooking from a previous verse. So we know what he's looking at from the previous verse. So it's supplied because he doesn't say it. He says something like, let me gulp down that red, this red, there. Okay? Very awkward, broken, stammering Hebrew. And so as you go through this, good translations should reflect his awkwardness. Because I think this speaks to his mindset as to how he was feeling, all right? And almost every translation to some degree is not willing to demonstrate. They want to smooth it out. They want to make it somewhat readable because my literal translation up there is not readable. And it's difficult to read in Hebrew too. That's why these commentaries, they pick up on this. So like, this is not good Hebrew. This doesn't reflect anything like Hebrew, all right? And so you've got some like, I pray thee with that same red pottage, for I am, feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage, for I am faint. Therefore, his name was called Edom. So does that sound like his register? I pray thee, right? And then you've got something like the NET, which I think does a close job here. Feed me some of that red stuff. Yes, this red stuff, because I'm starving. And then you've got the CSB. Let me eat some of that red stuff because I'm exhausted. Every translation to some degree smooths it out a little bit, but some are picking up on some of that stuff that he is throwing in there. The fact that he repeats red twice and he says this, that, red, and the word gulp down there. The word that he used there is a word that implies gorging. Okay, he wants to gorge himself. And so some say the word feed, and some say, like the NASB 20 says, let me have a mouthful. Okay, so there you go. There's some of that. Although the NLT here, which I think did a really good job on the last one here, smooths it out, in my opinion, way too much. I'm starved. Give me that red stew. Okay, so there's that. All right, but there's a smoothing here. And you want to try to capture that register. And this is what I said earlier. I find that translations have a hard time going lower. They have no problem elevating. All right, let's go to another example. Not to belabor the point too much, but here's another one. This is Rebecca. She's in extreme pain while pregnant, and she's trying to talk. So, ladies, some of you can try to relate to this more than us men. But she's in extreme pain, and she's trying to talk. In the Hebrew, she says something broken. She's having a hard time getting her words out. It's, if so, why this I? If so, why this I? And you'll see different translations handle this. I think the KJV here actually does a really good job trying to demonstrate how she said this. And it says, if it be so, why am I thus? Although I wouldn't use thus, okay? But if it be so, why am I thus? Okay, whereas the CSB really smooths it. Why is this happening to me? Okay, but it's really broken. She's in pain and she's trying to talk simultaneously. So imagine her register here is also very low. She's struggling to get the words out. Okay? So again, this is a reflection of register. All right? Now we're going to move on to the next one because I think we've done a number of examples there. Tone. Tone is the next one. The receptor, let's see my cursor. The receptor language conveys the same connotation as the source language. All right? And we all know this. This is really hard to do in text. All right? Whether it's text messaging or writing, it can be difficult to convey the tone, especially the tone of sarcasm. Right? Sarcasm is really difficult to come over in text. Today, we actually have helpful tools that are slowly, I think, inevitably going to end up as punctuation in our language ultimately, but emojis, right? I can throw a winky face at you and you know I'm not being serious, right? So just to be clear, throw a little LOL in there and don't take me too seriously on this text, right? Okay, those are forms of punctuation to convey a particular meaning. In this case, don't take me seriously. I've said something that could maybe offend you, and I don't want you to be offended, all right, if you take it the wrong way. All right, so tone, happy, mad, angry, so on. So let's I'm going to give you one of these here. Probably the one that, excuse me, tuned me into this very topic early on in my journey is from Job. In Job, tone and register are actually a really big thing. Job is very conversational, and they are talking with each other in common speak, but the book is written in poetry. So there's this push and pull of common speak and poetry that you can't always get both in English. All right, you can get one or the other. And in Job 13, Job has had enough of his friends. All right, he is so sick of their advice. And so he says here, let's look at it in the KJV. Oh, that ye would altogether hold your peace, and it should be your wisdom. Okay, very formal, very high. I remember growing up reading Job and feeling like the Job and his friends were posh Englishmen who were having a very polite disagreement, right? That's how I envisioned Job. They were just very uppity. However, I was listening to the CSB as an audiobook. I had never read the CSB before at this point, and I was listening to it, and I decided for whatever reason, no particular reason, to start in the book of Job with my read-through of the CSB. And it was the first time that I had read the book of Job, and I felt squeamish. I was like sitting in my chair while I was driving in my seat, and I was like, this feels like people who have real problems with each other. The way they speak to each other is rude. The way they are back and forth at each other's throats. And I, for the first time, felt like a real fly on a wall on how this conversation probably went down. And so the CSB here is what clued me in. It said, if only you would shut up and let that be your wisdom. And I was like, what? I've never, I was like, I actually paused it and I was like, there's no way it says that. And I went and looked it up. I was like, wow, it actually says that. And I was like, that's probably how we would say that in this language. I certainly wouldn't say hold your peace. So you can pick up that tone and register. This is now the tone. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah, so I have thought about that too. I didn't grow up that way, but I did know a number of kids who were not allowed to say shut up. Like it was offensive. It was as close to a swear word as you could get without actually swearing. I would say common speech today is people use this phrase all the time. And it's a small group of people that that would view that as a swear. And so you'll see the CSB is the only one that goes that way. But they can also tell in the Hebrew there that that's essentially the register and the tone that he would have had. However, yes, you have to be, this is the problem with translators, is they're like, how much can we say there's stuff I'm not even going to bring up in this class that I am uncomfortable bringing up in this class because of the tone and register of the Bible in particular areas. And so this came up when I asked that group of people about vulgarities in the Bible and how should we be translating them on that Facebook group. And the answer came back with, we should translate it accurately and let that inform our morals, not our morals inform our translation. Right? And I was like, okay, that's a good point. Because, let me put it to you this way, what we were working through as we worked through this on this forum was that vulgarities are very cultural, extremely cultural. And so I was making the point that there are certain things I can say in America I can't say in the UK. There's certain words. For example, in America, I can talk about a fanny pack. In the UK, super offensive. You would never use those words in the UK. That would be, and then there's words they can say in the UK that we would never use and go to the UK and talk about smoking a cigarette. They will use a word that we'll never use here, okay? So in that conversation, I was demonstrating that vulgarities or profanities or things of that nature are very, very cultural. My French background, all the vulgarities and swears are related to religion. Sacre bleu, it's curse the heavens. Tabernacle, it's tabernacle. That's a swear word in Canadian French. And another guy came up to me and or replied to me. He said he spent some time in the East. I want to say Japan. Don't quote me on that. And he said all of their swear words are related to eggs. And so the culture in Hebrew would not have necessarily found this the same level of offensiveness as we do today. So this is the complicated issue of trying to retain register and tone. I'm going to give you another one in a minute, and then I think this will be the last one. All right. Rabshakeh, okay, we have a king. We have a lot going on here. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through all of this, but we have a lot going on here. We have technical speak for political offices. Okay, we have technical speak for political offices. So Rabshakeh in the KJV makes it sound like it's his name. You'll see other translations put the definite article in front, the Rabshakeh, where we know now what we didn't know then, which is Rabshakeh is a political office. And so you'll see some translations not use Rabshakeh, the transliteration. They'll say chief advisor or the commander or the royal spokesperson or the chief of staff. It's hard to find a direct equivalent in English, so they're working with what we have. So you can either do the transliteration or you can find a translation that's as a close equivalent. So you'll see different ways there. The other thing you see here is that he is going to get to the city and he is going to tell them what he's about to do to them. In a very vulgar way, he's going to say, I'll choose the CSB to read this with. Right, let's see if I can get my cursor over there. Hasn't he also sent me to the men who sit on the wall, destined with you to eat their own excrement and drink their own urine? Now, imagine two commanders sitting at the war and speaking this way to each other. Is it likely he would use the words excrement and urine? Or would he use something more vulgar? He's there to intimidate. And what you're going to see here, someone actually sent me this one. I've known about this one for a while, but they sent this one to me and they were like, I feel like the KJV here retains the tone better. And I agreed with them. The tone is definitely captured, and the register is definitely captured in the KJV better, but only because of language change. Only because of language change, because these words weren't offensive in 1611. They've become offensive in English now. And so they used common English in 1611 that's become offensive in modern day. So I said they did retain the tone and register by accident. They had no idea that 100 years later it would retain the tone and register. They just chose to use common speech here. And so that's that. So you can see that this is just one example of tone and register going very low into areas of vulgarity that translators have a hard time. They have a hard time with how do I write this? And I got to let the pastor read this from the pulpit in a mixed room. That's on their mind. And some translations have actually said, our translation is not to be read from the pulpit. We're trying to capture, these aren't more popular ones, because the popular ones are not the ones that do this, but there are some translations that do exactly that. They say, hey, we're not going to soften this, and so we don't recommend you read this from the pulpit, okay? So there's that. All right, I want to try to do this. It's going to take me a couple of minutes here, but translation sacrifices, acrostics, poetry, right? We've talked about this before. We can't bring this over into English. Idioms, like I said, you would lose the sense if you brought the idiom over. If we said God had a long nose, it wouldn't make sense to us, right? And then lastly, wordplay. This is the one I want to spend a couple minutes on, and I'll try to close up the class. I know I'm going a little long, but thus the Lord God showed me, Amos 8, 1 and 2, behold, a basket of summer fruit, he said to Amos. He said, Amos, what do you see? So I said, a basket of summer fruit. Then the Lord said to me, the end has come upon my people Israel. And I have a question here. What does summer fruit have to do with any of this? Right? What do you see, Amos? Summer fruit. The end is near for Israel. What? That makes absolutely no sense in English, but there's wordplay that's happening here. So in the CSB, we see the same thing. Here's a basket of summer fruit. What do you see? Summer fruit. The end has come for my people Israel. All right, and then we get a footnote from the CSB and the ESV here. The word for summer fruit sounds like the word for end. Oh, okay, I'm clued in now. There's wordplay happening here, but I still don't get it. How does this work in Hebrew? All right, so here we have CSB on the left. How does it work in Hebrew? Other translations have said, you know what's really important here? It's the wordplay, not the sense. So we're going to translate the wordplay into English with wordplay of our own, so you can get the wordplay conversation. So the NLT says this: when the sovereign Lord showed me another vision, in it I saw a basket with ripe fruit. What do you see, Amos? He asked. I asked, a basket of ripe fruit. Then the Lord said, like this fruit, Israel is ripe for punishment. Oh, now I see it. The wordplay has to do with, in this case, it has to do with the word end, and summer fruit sound the same. Here we're using the word ripe for fruit and being ripe for punishment. Wordplay. Two different senses, the same word, same thing that's happening in Hebrew. And I thought that's really helpful. The NLT and the NIV here convey the wordplay, but they lose the sense. The sense is summer fruit. But in summer fruit, we lose the wordplay. You're gonna lose something. So this is where a combination of translations is really helpful. Either of these translations would have had to have done to be complete in and of themselves was to give me the wordplay in the footnote or give me the literal in the footnote. And then I wouldn't have to go to more than one translation, but I had to for this example. I get footnotes that clue me in, other translations that demonstrate it. And all I'm saying here, the last thing I want to say before we close out this section is, come on, and then I'll close it out. What makes an accurate translation is those three things: sense, register, and tone. We're going to lose stuff in acrostics, idioms, and wordplay. But when you compare translations, stop using translation comparison as destructive competition. My translation's better than yours. Okay? This is the most accurate translation. This is better than yours. Start using translation comparison with constructive complementation. This one helps illuminate this one. This one helps illuminate this one. Together, I am able to get a fuller sense of what's happening in the original language. I want them both, not I want this one over this one. Okay? Use them together. All right, that's all. Thank you for your time. You all are dismissed.